Okay, Borodar Pawb, hello everyone and welcome to our first joint online event with Social Care Wales. For those who don't know me, I'm Vicky Poole and I'm the Deputy Chief Inspector in Care Inspectorate Wales. We're using Microsoft Teams Live for this event. It's the first time that we've used it for a risk of provider event. It means that you'll only see and hear from the people who are presenting. We can't hear or see any of you and you don't need to worry about muting your microphone. I'm joined today by Sarah Glyn Jones, who's Head of Adult and Children's Services Inspection Team in CIW, and Catherine Thomas from Social Care Wales, as well as guest speaker Imogen Blood and a video from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. We also have other members of our teams online to help answer any questions. And later for our panel discussion, we'll be joined by Nicola Edwards from the Office of the Older People's Commissioner for Wales. As you can only see one person at a time, they'll introduce themselves as we move through the agenda. I'd like to thank you for joining us at a very busy time in what has been a very challenging year. And thank you for your remarkable fortitude and resilience in continuing to support people using your services and those working in them throughout this pandemic. We know what a difficult and challenging time this has been. We also know that this year has involved a fine balancing of risks, rights and responsibilities to ensure that people's human rights and their health is protected. And this has included very difficult balance of promoting the rights of one person and many people. And that's why we've chosen this as a topic for our first virtual event. And we did do a do poll and asked what people wanted us to focus this first virtual event around. And this was the top topic. And we hope it's helpful in supporting your decision making as leaders in social care. You can submit any written questions or comments via the chat box on the right hand side of your screen. A moderator will then publish the questions and comments for everyone to see. All questions are anonymous by default, but you can add your name if you want to. We are going to have a panel discussion after the break and we'll be encouraging you to submit your questions for the panel just before and during the break, and I hope you're able to stay with us for this part of the event too. Today's event has been run in English, but please feel free to submit your written questions in Welsh if you wish to. I hope you'll bear with us if we have any technical glitches. We think there's about 120 people with us today. So let's hope that everybody's okay and can hear and see us okay. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can email ciwcoms@gov.wales and we'll do our best to help. This event is being recorded and be made available for others to see afterwards. After each segment, we'll try and answer a couple of questions, but we'll be asking you to keep your questions for the panel discussion at the end too. If we don't answer your question, please don't worry, as we'll collate all the questions posted to us at the end of the event and publish written responses on our website. We'll email you directly when this becomes available. So let me run through the agenda. So first we're starting with an introduction from Care Inspectorate Wales and Social Care Wales. Then Imogen is going to introduce the work that she's been doing, and I'll leave Imogen to introduce that herself. We have a video from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and that's because they weren't able to join Teams Live in the way that we're running this, so they've recorded their presentation for us. And then we're going to have a comfort break and ask you to submit your questions and come back for a panel discussion. I have to say all timings are loose and approximate, and we'll see how we get on as we run through this. And so now I'm going to hand over to Sarah Glyn Jones to give an update on CIW.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Sarah Glyn Jones and I'm the Head of Inspection for Adult and Children's Services, Care Inspectorate Wales. Welcome to you all this morning. It's really good that we've been able to hold this event, albeit that it's a new way of communicating with people. I've attended a couple of events over the last few months, one pre-recorded with domiciliary support service managers and one with a Care for All Wales event. But what I'll do is I'll give you a brief overview of what we've been doing over the last year and a little bit about what we're doing now and where we're going over the next couple of months. So you will know that we suspended our inspections, apart from those of very serious concern, very early on in the pandemic, and we maintained contact with all of you through very regular phone calls, just checking in with you all to know what was happening in your services and provide support to you, acting as a link with communicating between yourselves and other partners. We changed our tack slightly moving into the summer. We started re-inspecting again in June, and alongside that we undertook monitoring calls, and I think that most of you now will have had a monitoring call from our inspectors with more of a regulatory focus on our discussions. We've also been working very closely with our partners in health and social care to get feedback about services and to share any concerns between agencies. And alongside that, we've maintained our communications both with Policy Social Care Wales, various other partners, to make sure that you get all the information that you need to help you through what's been a very, very difficult time. In terms of our inspections, we've undertaken well over 100 inspections now of services. What we've been doing is focusing on the services that concern us the most. So where we've had concerns raised, or if there have been safeguarding issues, where there is outstanding non-compliance, where we want to make sure that you've made the progress that you need to. And alongside that, we've been looking at some of the overdue inspections. Obviously, with not having inspected services for a number of months, there are services that need inspection, particularly those that are newly registered. So we've been focusing our energies on those services. And it's been really good to see that in the main, despite all the pressures that have been going on, you've continued to provide really good quality services to people under difficult circumstances. Some of the things that we've also been doing have been trialling new approaches, and that's included using virtual technology. So rather than spend ages in services, we want to spend as least time as possible in a service and make sure we decrease any risks to people using services. So we've been trialling new approaches using Skype to talk to people who use services, to talk to staff, to talk to managers and RIs, which has been working really well. We've tended to use that alongside our inspection visits, although we have, for some inspections, undertaken the whole inspection through virtual technology, which has been interesting for everybody concerned, I think. What we'll be doing is we'll be considering feedback from our staff and from yourselves around that technology to think about where we go with that in the future, because we see it as being a really useful tool in our toolbox for inspection going forward. A couple of things going into the next few months that you'll be interested in. We're looking at developing direct messaging so that you'll be able to upload information for us through your online, through our online service, which will provide a much more secure way of sharing information between ourselves and you. And we're hoping that that will be up and running in February, and we'll be running some sessions to inform you as to how that will work in practice. Alongside that, you will know that we have got, all of us, in our calendars, the annual return and ratings. In terms of the annual return, I anticipate that going forward. So as previously, it will be 56 days. Gosh, I'm hoping I've got the number of days right, after the 1st of April, which will take us to the end of May for the date for submission of annual return. But we'll be communicating with you further about that. In terms of ratings, I would suggest that we might be watching this space, and we'll be maintaining contact with you about that as well, as there may well be changes to when that commences. I can see that I'm using up loads of time here, and I think I need to hand over to Social Care Wales. Have a lovely Christmas, everybody, and a Happy New Year.
Thanks, Sarah. That was great. Hello, folks. Good morning. Bore da. Catherine Thomas, cyfarwyddwr cymorthwyol gwella dwi. I'm Catherine Thomas, I've forgotten what it was in English now, Assistant Director for Improvement, that's it, in Social Care Wales. How ridiculous of me. So I'm just going to give you a quick run through as to some high level projects that I think you might be interested in. Obviously, if you do want to hear more on any of the things I mentioned now, please just put a note in the chat and we can come back to you. We've got some colleagues from Social Care Wales as well sitting in the background who will be able to answer questions should they come up today. But as I say, put anything that you want to, any links that you think you might be interested in, and we can send all that to you before the Christmas break. Thank you. So just in terms of the workforce, one of the big things we've been asked to do by Welsh Government particularly is to look at some of the wellbeing and resilience issues that people are struggling with. So whilst, you know, I do entirely recognise that we've not been able to reach each and every one of you with this work, we have been doing some work with, for example, home care managers in terms of a peer support network called Time for You, and that's gone really well. It's still being used and attended by the home care managers who have asked for it to continue. So that as a model is something we're going to be looking at rolling out and making more available to people. We've also been supporting in our usual way some senior managers throughout the 22 local authorities, particularly because they find themselves quite isolated in their roles. So we've been running a programme called Leading by Example, which sees assistant directors and heads of service come together and in action learning sets and actually to share intelligence about how they are managing. And this year, for the first time, we have actually managed to include 3 directors from provider organisations as well, and that's worked out really well. The richness of sharing intelligence across sectors, I think, should never be underestimated. We're also, as you'll be aware of the We Care Wales campaign, and we've been asked just this week actually by Welsh Government, whilst that campaign is going really well and we've got full engagement across all providers and councils, it's been really well. You have responded excellently to our requests to support this campaign, and you've taken it and made it your own in so many instances. It's been brilliant. But we've been asked very recently by Welsh Government to help with the recruitment drive, because obviously we all know the pressures now on the workforce are immense. Unprecedented is the word we hear constantly, isn't it? But that is very true. So we've been asked to support that way in terms of maybe coming up with some minimum standards around training for people who will be brought in to support the work you're doing either in care homes or home care, and that goes right across the piece, children and adults, exactly the same. So that's one piece that we are actively now, as of last week, putting all our energies into supporting you with the recruitment and what that means for you. The children's agenda. We do a lot of work with the children's agenda, and really pleased at the moment that the residential children's group, which is part of the ministerial advisory group for better outcomes for looked after children, they have chosen to continue their work and meeting during this pandemic, and they are moving forward with their residential children's annual conference in March, which we are supporting and which will involve all providers, some local authority representatives, but also young people, care experience, care leavers, but also some young children who are currently in care. Really looking forward to that. So we'll put details about that for you following this meeting as well. The other big thing we've done, and this has been going towards the adult agenda more, is the end of life aspect, which has, you know, accelerated clearly in these very difficult times. In the early part of the crisis, so back in sort of April and May, we were having lots and lots of contacts from people saying, can you help us with this? Can you help us with the end of life? You know, because we've never dealt with this level of demand, and you know, the skills and the confidence of staff is taking a huge battering because they're just inundated by family members, by professionals, by colleagues, etc. So on the Social Care Wales website, there is an excellent, I would recommend it actually, it is a really excellent end of life resource area, but it also covers young people, all sorts of difficult situations where people will be facing that. But we have been particularly asked in the last couple of months to help people think about end of life and dementia. So at the moment there are a number of 8 bite-size workshops going on, which have been put together by health and social care partners, and we were delighted with them. The first one we had was on, well, last week, the 8th of December, and I think 160 of you joined that one. It was really, really well done, and that was the first 4, and we have a series of the rest of the series rather is coming up in January and February. Again, you can have all the details on that, but early feedback from that is that people have found it really, really useful. It's simple language, and it just gives tips as to how to really manage those very, very difficult circumstances that some of you guys find yourselves in. The last but one thing I'll mention is, as a result, funnily enough, of the difficulties that people have been having with the pandemic, we've seen a big shift in terms of people looking at the way they deliver home care, particularly looking at how community resilience can be built up to be sustained in the long term. So a colleague of mine is leading with a really good cross-section of people, trying to look at how we maximise and keep some of those really innovative ideas that you've come up with in terms of community resilience, and how commissioning and contracting from local authorities can really support the provider sector to keep that initiative going. It's really hard, but there is a huge amount of enthusiasm to drive this work forward and to learn from each other. And finally, the Imogen Blood now is going to talk to you after I finished my ramble, but the work that Imogen did for us comes from a much wider piece of work, which is on balancing risks, rights and responsibilities. It's all generic work, so it applies equally to children and adults. Clearly, the way you have conversations with different people in different categories, you know, we're all different, aren't we? So your conversation will change, but the principles of how you have good conversations and the judgments that you need to make when you're balancing those risks and responsibilities are pretty similar across the piece. So what we've done to support that work now is we have, for the past 5 years, some of you will be aware of it, we've been doing some training on building the skills and confidence of the workforce around collaborative skills. So really getting to that strengths-based conversation with families and individuals. We now have, as a result of that, a champions and mentoring group across Wales, which is made up of providers and statutory workers alike. We've got around 150 people as part of that mentoring group now. If you want more information on that, please come to me. And the final bit that we're doing now, and this is the bit I'd be really interested in you looking at for us, is we've done over the past 10 months some work on case recording. Excuse me. Case recording and what the good principles of case recording can look like. We've been really pleased that we've been partnered by CIW, ADSS Cymru, huge numbers of provider organisations, some education colleagues and health colleagues. So our first draft of this resource is now available. And if you would like to look at it, you know, mull it over, use it. The whole point of this work is that we can come together to agree what good case recording looks like, so we can have one holistic, generic set of principles right across the piece, so there's no confusion as to what they should be. And at the heart of the case recording work is the individual and how we really put the strengths and needs of that individual clearly and upfront in our case recording. Again, if you'd like to see that work, just put your name in the chat and we can send you a copy, because it's just hot off the press now. I think probably that's it now. So I'm going to hand over to Imogen, who's been part of this balance and risks work with us in Social Care Wales, and ask her to introduce herself. Diolch yn fawr pawb. Diolch yn fawr, Imogen.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for the introduction. I hope everyone can hear me and see my slides. Yes, my name's Imogen Blood and I am an independent researcher. My background is originally in social work, but I've been working in qualitative research for many years, and then later on in training and research with particular interests around strength-based practice and around positive risk. So what I'm going to talk to you today about are 3 pieces of work which were commissioned by Social Care Wales. If I can just have the next slide, that they should set those pieces of work out. And the first was back in 2018, where we were originally asked to look at this idea of positive risk and shared decision making, two pieces of terminology that were being increasingly used. And we had a really good look at the kind of emerging research evidence. We looked at lots of different examples of policies and of practice. And we held a series of focus groups with, in that piece of work, pretty much all professionals, but a really wide range of professionals from lots of different sort of layers, from management through to frontline practice, from care homes through to people working in integrated roles. And we really just started to try and unpick what this idea of risk meant, really, and how that was kind of landing within social care settings, what some of the challenges were, what some of the grey areas were, what were the things that helped people, to practitioners, to make decisions around risk. We were then really excited to be commissioned to come back again and sort of do a follow-up piece of work from that the following year. One of the things that we'd felt very keenly in that first piece of work was that we just hadn't, given the sort of timescales of it, really been able to engage people who use services. So we had an opportunity working with our long-term collaborators, Practice Solutions, to do a much more in-depth piece of work where we were able to co-produce principles around risk-taking and risk decision making and the balancing of rights with a range of different groups. That included people with learning disabilities, older people, people with physical disabilities, a range of different groups that we work with up and down Wales. And we, at the outset, we were like, how are we going to do what's a very, very abstract kind of process with these different groups? And we basically developed some very short little cards which set out very simple scenarios that we felt, we hoped resonated with people, both practitioners and people using services. And we used those as a prompt to kind of then draw out from people who use services what they expected and wanted from professionals, and what they also didn't want professionals to do in those kinds of scenarios. And I'm going to share with you in a moment some of the kind of key messages that came out of that really rich piece of work. And then finally, we were asked in 2019 to really look at how some of these concepts applied over in the child protection world, obviously a very different sector, and one in which the idea of positive risk, you know, is I guess not really a kind of a particularly familiar concept, but we had a much wider look at whether and how, you know, practitioners are thinking about balancing rights and working in an engaged way with families and with children. So that's the body of work that I'm going to share some of the kind of findings and reflections from. If we can just have the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So I'm going to share with you the next few slides, the kind of key messages that came out of that piece of work around co-producing those principles. What does all of this mean from the perspective of people using services? I guess the really key thing that kind of came out first and foremost was that actually we need to start with what matters most to the person. And it sounds really obvious, especially in these post-social services and wellbeing Act days where we hear all the time about beginning with a what matters conversation. But when we're thinking about risk assessments, it's a real game changer if we begin by thinking about what matters most to the person, rather than beginning with what might possibly go wrong here. It sets a completely different tone for conversations about how we work together in the face of risk and how we balance rights within that. So people said to us things like, talk to the person, find out what they mean, what risk means to them, why they want to do something, what they want to do, get the full picture. And really what came out of that was just how important it is that staff have the time to have those conversations, that they can really build the skills necessary to draw out what people's aspirations are, what their hopes and fears and worries might be, that there's a relationship of trust there, that people feel they can articulate worries without things running out of control and assumptions being made, and that people have the time and the respect really to sort of focus on what matters most to them. And this point about not making assumptions came up time and time again. This idea of needing to remain curious. It's all too easy, isn't it, when we're working with lots of people, especially when we're under a lot of pressure, to kind of look for some of those shortcuts to kind of thinking, oh, we know how this one plays out, or oh, we've been in this position before, we've met this this kind of person before, and actually remaining curious and remaining alert to what makes this individual tick was felt to be the real crux and foundation of good, positive risk assessment and planning. Another key point that came up frequently was this idea actually that we need to weigh up all the different options that are on the table, that quite often we don't really look at the risks of doing nothing as opposed to the risks of doing something, whatever that something might be that we're considering, and that often we don't think about the risks of putting in a service. We only think about the risks of not putting in a service. So it's easy to kind of focus on, you know, what are the risks for an individual of remaining in their own home, but what are the risks of an individual of making a move into a different setting. So really important that we give each of those options a really honest and reflective look. If I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. And this idea of hearing everyone's hopes and fears. There was a really nice blog by a guy called Stephen Finlayson a few years ago when he questioned whether actually this language of risk and risk assessment is a helpful one, really. It makes the whole thing sound very technical, and actually, you know, really what we're talking about here are the hopes and fears of a range of different people, including the professionals involved. You know, we have hopes and fears. We hope that things are going to work out. We have fears that we're going to be left as the only one in the room if things don't work out as planned. So actually, you know, something there about really hearing, what does everybody want to get from this situation, and what kinds of concerns do we have? And then really important not to overlook the risk of emotional and psychological harm. We often understandably focus on the physical risks out of any situation. And Charlotte Clark, who's a researcher working around dementia, has written beautifully about this idea of hidden harms, that actually sometimes we can make somebody safe, physically as safe as they possibly can be, but actually, you know, the emotional harms for them of perhaps living a very restricted life can actually sometimes be just as pernicious and just as dangerous to the individual. This idea that actually we need, once we've kind of laid out those aspirations and the foundations, to really work together to use available resources and to be creative. Some of the quotes that came out from people that we co-produced the principles with were things like work through scenarios with the person, you know, find ways to reduce risks, find alternatives, be creative. Those were some of the messages that came out. And then, of course, the understanding that things can change. And this is really difficult when we're busy, you know, kind of investing the time to sort of make a comprehensive, co-produced kind of risk assessment in the first place is difficult enough. But it's easy, if we're not careful, for those risk assessments to kind of remain quite static, when actually things are changing all the time. People's aspirations, their capabilities, the whole context is shifting. So we need to find ways to adapt that really lively and really flexibly, so that we don't get kind of trapped in decisions that were made years ago, or trapped in blanket decisions that we made on the back of another scenario from some time ago. So how do we kind of keep that momentum? And then on the last slide of this set, please, Emma. The idea that we need to really be collaborative in our decision making and planning, and this can be hugely challenging, both in terms of, you know, our power balances, in terms of who gets to make the final decision, but this sense actually that, you know, we actually need to work together to make decisions. So this is a really key aspect in terms of why we should work in this way. We know that from lots of the research that actually when we do collaborate in decision making and planning, you know, there's an increased likelihood of improved outcomes. For example, there's some really good research that we reviewed when we were looking at children's services and child protection that suggests that actually when parents are involved in developing child protection plans, they're more likely to be successful. There's been some lovely research on older people when actually, on a range of cases where older people who had decisions to take risks taken away from them then ended up covertly risk taking. There was a beautiful example in some research we were involved in a few years ago when actually an older person older person's family had come in while they were in hospital and risk assessed the house with a professional, and they'd moved lots of bits of furniture, they'd moved rugs out of the way, way. And what came to light further down the line was that actually the older person was, when the family and the professionals weren't there, was moving the coffee table on their own back into the place where it had always been in the past, because that's where they wanted it. And that's always stuck in my mind as one of the risks, that actually if we don't collaboratively make decisions together at that point, then people find ways to kind of do what they want to do, don't they? And often in doing so end up taking greater risks than actually if we'd have had a conversation about why it mattered that the coffee table was in the position where it was, and what we could do to improve safe passage around that. So really clear example there for me around the covert risk taking in the coffee table. How do we avoid that? And then, of course, another reason why it's important to work in this way is that potentially it can be more cost effective. Now, this is a really controversial one, because I think when we're talking about the kind of amount of time that we need to invest in building relationships and being collaborative in our decision making, I guess one of the first concerns is we just don't have the resource to work in that way. We just don't have the time to invest. But it feels as though this, based on the evidence that is emerging, is a real invest to save scenario, because of course if we don't invest that time in trying to work collaboratively with people around risk, we end up with people entering long-term care where perhaps they could have been supported at home for longer. We end up with people moving into higher forms of perhaps more restrictive care or into nursing care because they've perhaps not had the opportunity to continue to take risks and to maintain their mobility. We end up with more children being taken into local authority care because we didn't invest the time earlier on to work with those families in ways that kind of support them to build their capacity. So it's a controversial area, and I'm not suggesting for a minute we should be doing this because it's cost effective, but actually there are real cost inefficiencies if we ignore this agenda and we don't invest the time in balancing risks, rights and responsibilities. And then if we can just move on to the next slide, please. Another reason to work in this way, obviously, is the law and the policy and the regulation. So I've touched already on the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. Obviously, within that Act, very clear messages there around facilitating choice and autonomy and working towards the outcomes that matter most to people, all those kind of key foundations for working in a positive way around risk. Obviously, a real balance there across children's as well as adults around identifying strengths and protective factors as well as looking at risks. Within the Code of Practice for Inspection, there's a real emphasis there on looking at how service providers promote people's rights and ensure that people have choice and control, as well as, of course, making sure that they're safe. In the codes of professional practice, there's a direct need there to kind of balance rights and responsibilities and risks with individuals, and lots of messages there around how we need to work with individuals to maximise choice and control. The Mental Capacity Act is really key here. Lots of the examples we heard in our early rounds of research with practitioners actually involved decisions taken by courts of protection which were much more permissive in relation to risk taking than the original practice decisions had been. And that was often because either there'd been a lack of understanding around the fluctuating capacity that individuals have, and the fact that capacity is decision specific, and sometimes that's about not recognising people's rights to make unwise decisions. So, often, although fears around capacity were one of the things that could get in the way, many of the kind of case law examples that we looked at suggested actually that the Mental Capacity Act often takes a much more positive approach to balancing rights and responsibilities. And then, of course, the Human Rights Act and the fundamental principles that fall out of that. And I think also that the Equality Act is really important here when we think about, the rights of disabled people and older people to live full lives. And we think about the rights of people from different ethnic groups, different sexual orientations to connect with and fully live the lifestyles they want to live. So there's a real kind of underpinning there, a framework around regulation and law. Around that can guide us in this area. So I just want to unpick in this last second half of the presentation a little bit more of what this means and what gets in the way and what supports us. And I guess if we can just move on to the next slide, I just wanted to spend a moment or two thinking about this idea of whose risk is it anyway? I think one of the things that came out as soon as we started talking to citizens about this agenda was that actually some of the things we as professionals describe as risks wouldn't be described as risks by ordinary people talking about their ordinary lives. You know, and that actually when we start to unpick what the real hopes and fears are for people, this kind of list of things tends to come up. People were worried about losing their independence. And obviously sometimes people recognise that they needed to be quite risk averse in their own lives in order to not risk losing their independence. So, you know, meeting older people who daren't go out at all in the winter because they don't want to slip and then end up needing a lot of care and not being able to continue living in their own homes. People had fears about losing control over my life. That was a kind of recurring theme. People worried about becoming isolated. People worried about not being able to do the things that matter to them. People were concerned about losing their confidence, and people were concerned about not being heard. So it's really important that we as professionals stand back and kind of think, you know, what have other people got to lose in this situation? What are the hopes and fears of the people we're working with, as well as the hopes and fears of the professionals and the risks and concerns of our organisations? On the next slide, I just want to share with you a cartoon that always makes me smile. This is a care home setting with your care home fall preventions poster on the walls. And here's a person lying here permanently to reduce my risk of falling. And I think that just brings home all those other kind of hidden harms that can come if actually we take too safe an approach and we focus too narrowly on those perhaps more obvious physical risks. We overlook the fact that actually lying on the floor is not going to allow a person to have any real sense of enjoyment or connection with others. And then actually it can bring about other risks. People could trip over you, you could get bed sores. So we can become easily focused on one dimension of risk and end up shutting out a whole load of other really important aspects of a person's well-being. So I just want to spend the last little bit thinking about what can get in the way of us working in this way, because I know it's really easy me sitting here reflecting on all of this at a very high level, but you as responsible individuals are there every day kind of balancing really tough decisions, really practical challenges around all of this. And I think one thing that came home to us the more we got into this whole agenda is just that there are a myriad of grey areas. You know, it would be lovely to be able to say this is exactly where the line is, but this is all incredibly context specific. It's all very individually led, and it can leave people on the front line with huge dilemmas, and I don't want to underestimate any of that. So let's just think a little bit about what can get in the way on the next slide before thinking a bit about how we can strengthen our approach at an organisational level. So although I presented that whole kind of rake of you know, legal frameworks and regulatory kind of underpinnings to work in a way that really seeks to balance rights and responsibilities within our risk assessments, this fear around the duty of care was something that came up quite a lot in our conversations with professionals. And it's a really complicated area. You know, the more you look into it, again, there aren't necessarily the sorts of clear lines. It would be really nice to be able to say this is exactly the bottom line for you here. But clearly this idea that we'll come back to in a moment, and I know Catherine touched on, around recording and defensible decision making is absolutely critical. And of course, the duty of care fundamentally links to this idea of us practicing within our professional frameworks, and of course that code of professional practice and some of the messages it gives there is a really, you know, is the kind of core framework for us there. But understandably, lots of fears, particularly when we're working perhaps with colleagues in health, around litigation, around, you know, how far do we support somebody with fluctuating capacity to make an unwise decision? What do we do if a person, you know, repeatedly refuses to let us cut their toenails? How long do we allow them to go before we're in you know, at risk of being seen to be negligent? So some real genuine concerns there that need regular reflection. And I've just touched on it there, but that lack of understanding from other colleagues, from relatives, people, lots of people working in social care said, they often felt pressured by colleagues in health who were taking a more risk-averse approach. Perhaps there'd been a decision from a consultant that a person lacked capacity and nobody else felt confident enough to challenge that. Perhaps that fear of kind of litigation being much stronger in those sectors. Perhaps there's pressure in children's services from colleagues in education who want problem solving now and look to us to do that. Lots of people working in the older people's sector said that relatives understandably prioritise their relative safety and can put a lot of pressure on people in care settings to not take risks for lest their relative be exposed to harm. So there can be a real kind of myriad of balancing acts there with all those other voices. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier that it takes real time to invest in working in this very collaborative, strength-based way with people. And often we simply don't have that time. Over this year, more than ever, we've been, responding to crises, trying to make top-down decisions and implement them as best we can when it's real life and death scenarios, that we're faced with. So it can be really difficult to, have those very nuanced conversations when we're in crisis mode. And then, of course, and this is, perhaps one of the more controversial elements, I guess, especially when we're sitting here and talking to colleagues around from the Inspectorate around, how do we judge performance? Is it about, the numbers of assessments that we do? Is it about the number of incidents that occur, or is it about those softer things around quality and people feeling supported to live the lives they want to? And of course, there's something there about making decisions alone, which, all the research suggests that actually we make the most risk-averse decisions when we feel unsupported. When our backs are against the wall, we think, oh, I don't want this coming back on me. Where actually, if we can have that kind of collective decision making, we feel much more empowered to take positive risks in our practice. So let's end by thinking about what can enable this type of working. Having considered some of those barriers, let's end on some strengths and some positives. So there's something really key about an organisational commitment to putting this into practice. There was a lovely piece of research done a few years ago by a researcher called Hawkins. It's a really nice study called "If They Don't Use It, They Lose It." And it compared the practice in two different care homes, both of which, in terms of their kind of surface mission, said that they aim to really promote the independence of the people living in the care home. Both kind of said that they wanted to promote people's rights and they wanted to, give people every opportunity to, live life to the full within the home. Yet actually, when the researchers went in and spent many hours observing practice, it was really clear that in one home, a huge amount of time had been put in every day to working in a very flexible way to supporting individuals to make their own way through the home. So every meal time, there was a big organisational commitment to spending time, supporting individuals to walk down to the dining room, with a bit of a hand under the elbow as needed, and to really take the time to make that happen. In the other care home, although everything was being done, both of these were exceptional institutions, really good places. But in the other care home, it was a kind of case of quickly getting people down there as safely as possible, pushing them along in wheelchairs, and actually getting them from A to B. And so there's something there, isn't there, about, just how do we prioritise within our organisations? How do we actually build this into the fabric of our day-to-day operations? What does that look like? What does that mean? What decisions do we make to make that happen? How do we organise our resources if we're serious about creating those opportunities for people to move around independently? And obviously lots of that's about staff time and about skills development. It can take so much more skill to work in that enabling, re-abling way. It can take so much more skill to engage with children and young people on their own terms and really take time to understand what matters to them. And a theme that comes up time and time again is about the power of regular reflection, about needing to come together with your supervisor and reflect on the codes of professional practice and what that means in relation to a particular particular decision you might be grappling with, to come together as a team and really challenge each other around the decisions we're making, to reflect, to have that kind of boldness to think, is there a way that we can make this happen, and to challenge each other where there are perhaps risks that we hadn't thought about. And I guess there's a theme there around this idea of a parallel process, that actually we can't work in a strength-based collaborative way with the individuals we support if we don't also work in a strength-based collaborative way with the teams that we manage, starting with their hopes and fears and their strengths, and thinking about how we can build on those. Catherine touched earlier on how we record decisions, and I think a really key message is of the importance of recording decisions, that we need to make sure that our decision making is defensible rather than defensive, and that we're really clear that if a person's made a decision that this really matters to them, that we've recorded that, and that we've recorded the steps we've taken to try and make that safe. And, you know, that point I made earlier about collective responsibility, you know, we can't work in this way on our own. We need the support of our colleagues, of our teams. We need the support of people's families. We need the support of those wider institutions, of our colleagues in legal or in education or in health, if we're going to work in this way effectively. And I think that feels like a really key point to end, because I know that agenda of widening out. So this isn't just a social services, it isn't just a social services and wellbeing act, it isn't just social care, that this is a collective system-wide responsibility. And if we want to both keep people safe but make sure that we don't overprotect them, we need to broaden out those conversations. So hopefully that's set some kind of some sort of tone for the session and some broad principles. Thank you very much for the time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Imogen. There's lots of really thought-provoking things in there, and the output of Imogen's work is available on the social care website, and we'll share links to that at the end of today. I think often people talk about, well, we're worried about what CIW inspectors will say if we do positive risk taking, and I think that at the heart of that is about defensible decision making. What we don't want to see is a one-size-fits-all approach and blanket decisions being made for people, but actually individual decisions being made with people, with their families, with their advocates, and that is recorded and is clear why those decisions have been made. That's what we're looking for in our practice. And we've got some inspectors on this call today, and we'll be sharing this with them as well. So we're not just saying this to you, we are saying this internally to us and how we work as well. Imogen, there's been one question posted, and if anybody wants to post any other questions, please do. The question is, how could this work better with young people in relation to risk of suicide and collaborative working with CAMS?
Yeah, interesting. I was just watching a really interesting TED talk the other day about contextual safeguarding, actually, which kind of resonates back to that point I just left us on there about how we really need to widen out the kind of, you know, the players that are involved in decision making, and that piece of work reflected actually that our children and family services focus very much on this idea that we raise a concern, and then a social care professional or a CAMS professional works with the family. And actually, you know, we need to widen that so that we're really looking at the much broader kind of context within which children move. So obviously education, but also the kind of places and spaces and community networks that are involved there. So there's something really important for that group of young people as well, in terms of broadening that out, so that we're it's not just about us, and it's not just about the families, that we do need to kind of have that wider buy-in if we're going to keep children who are at risk of suicide safer. And I think, yeah, you know, collaborative work with CAMS, absolutely. That, you know, I mean, I hear lots of, I mean, I work closely with lots of colleagues in CAMS who are working in this way, but I also know it's a hugely overstretched service. And again, you know, that sort of sense that there just isn't the time and the ability to connect across these services in the way that we might like is an ongoing challenge. But I see real opportunity there for trying to widen that kind of collaborative net around young people in that situation.
Okay, Thank you, Imogen. Thank you. Post questions, and we'll come back to those in the Q&A at the end. So if there are things that occurred to you as you're kind of digesting that, then please do post your questions. We're now going to move on to show the video. I'm crossing my fingers and my toes here to show the video prepared for us by Equality and Human Rights Commission, and you'll hear from Geraint and Harrod about this. So here we go. Let's hope.
Hello, my name is Geraint Rees. I'm a Senior Associate at the Equality and Human Rights Commission in Wales. I'm part of a small team here in Wales working on our social care programme, and I'm also joined today by my colleague Angharad Price, who will introduce herself shortly. We're really grateful to Care Inspectorate Wales for the invitation to come and speak at the event today. As we'll go on to explain, the social care programme is a new programme of work for the Commission developed this year, and we are really pleased to come and speak about that programme of work, but specifically a piece of work that we published in October, an equality and human rights briefing on the impact of the pandemic in care homes in Wales. It will be really important for our work in this area to be successful, that we understand and hear from you about the issues that care providers face and the challenges that you're facing. And we're really grateful for any feedback that you have for us on how useful and relevant that you find the briefing. Before we go on to cover some of that, I thought, and Harrod thought, we would give you a bit of an introduction about who we are and what we do at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So the Equality and Human Rights Commission was established in 2007. We brought together the work of 3 previous organisations whose remits covered race, sex and disability, and we added the new grounds of sexual orientation, gender reassignment, religion and belief and age, and of course the remit around human rights. We are an independent statutory body working across England, Scotland and Wales, and in Wales we have a statutory Wales committee, as they do in Scotland, whose role it is to ensure that the Commission's work reflects the devolved context in our countries, and those committees have specific powers to advise the Welsh and Scottish governments around equality and human rights. We have a duty to protect, enforce and promote the equality legislation in the UK. We're the regulator of the Equality Act 2010, which is the major piece of equality legislation, which Angharad's going to cover in a bit more detail. We have a remit to promote human rights, and as a national human rights institution, we monitor the UK and Welsh Government's performance against its international human rights obligations. We work as an information provider, so we help people to understand their rights, and we support organisations in understanding what their obligations are and how they can comply with the equality and human rights legislation. We are an influencer, so we use our legal expertise, our research, our analysis to be able to influence public policy, advise governments and inform public debates. We are an evaluator, so we produce research, we measure progress. Specifically, we have a statutory duty to publish a State of the Nation report on equality and human rights every 3 years called Is Britain Fairer? And we produce a report in Wales called Is Wales Fairer? And we're an enforcer, so we use our specific legal powers, which Angharad's going to cover, to protect people against breaches of their rights, to clarify the equality and human rights law, and to support organisations to comply with the legislation.
Hi, my name's Angharad Price and I'm Legal Principal Wales at the Commission, and I work with Geraint. I started about a year ago because the Commission recognised that we needed Welsh legal expertise, because so many areas, just like social care that we're going to talk about today, but also health and education, are devolved to Wales, and those issues touch upon equality and human rights so much that we needed specific Welsh expertise for our legal team. I'm first of all going to talk about key legislation, and then I'm going to move on to the legal powers that the Commission has in its role as regulator for the Equality Act 2010, and also as National Human Rights Institute, where we report to the UN on the UN conventions. So starting off with key legislation, Obviously, the two pieces of legislation I'm going to talk about are the Equality Act 2010 and also the Human Rights Act 1998. And you're probably aware, you know, the Equality Act 2010 brought together over 116 pieces of legislation into one act. 10 years ago, it was to simplify and bring together all of the different separate pieces of legislation. There are 9 protected characteristics under the Act, and you'll be hopefully well aware of the obligations for organisations and individuals not to discriminate, you know, directly, indirectly, and other forms of discrimination that are protected within the Act. One of the specific duties, though, on public sector organisations and those who exercise public functions, hopefully you'll be aware, is the public sector equality duty. And that is a general duty on public bodies to eliminate unlawful discrimination, advance equality of opportunity, and importantly, foster good relations between people who share protected characteristics and those who do not share them. And in Wales, we have a specific duties that sit underneath that general public sector equality duty that require public bodies that are listed in Wales, you know, to incorporate things like preparing equality impact assessments and thinking about equality and discrimination and advancing opportunity and fostering good relations when they're making decisions. And hopefully you're aware of those because they should shine through in terms of social care decision making from health bodies, local authorities and Welsh Government itself. The Human Rights Act obviously sets out the fundamental rights and freedoms that everyone in the UK is entitled to, and I'll touch on some of the specifics a bit later on, and I talk about our briefing, which draws the key articles of the European Convention on Human Rights, which are brought into UK law within the Human Rights Act. And one of our key responsibilities as a Commission is to report on the human rights situation in the UK. So we report to UN committees on how well the UK and Welsh Government are doing complying with the different UN treaties. And again, I'll come on to some of the specifics on that when I talk about the briefing later on. But you'll be fully aware the Human Rights Act gives an individual right of redress, so people can bring claims if they think that a public body or again someone carrying out a public function has breached one of their human rights. But more importantly, really, hopefully, people, public bodies making decisions and organisations making decisions will hopefully think about the Human Rights Act when they are making those decisions about people's lives. And this year, during the current pandemic, we've seen significant restrictions on people's civil liberties and interference with human rights on a scale that we've just never seen before. But we really want people to focus on what is appropriate, even in the current exceptional circumstances. I'm therefore going to move on and talk about the legal powers that we have at the Commission, and our legal powers come from the Equality Act 2006. I'm broadly going to talk about 3 different areas. So firstly, we have a range of powers that include inquiry powers, where we can generally collect evidence in a certain area to try and improve practice and compliance with the Equality Act 2010. So, for example, last year I was working on an inquiry we had into the criminal justice system, which was about disabled people, particularly those with neurodiverse conditions or learning disabilities, and their experience in the criminal justice system, particularly when they had to appear remotely at court, you know, via a video link, something that's really common now, but other than the criminal justice system wasn't that common in the court system. So we published our report in June, and it gave really broad evidence, collected evidence around those issues, and then, you know, presented general recommendations to the specific bodies involved in that area. You're probably aware we're currently have announced we're conducting an inquiry into race issues in the health and social care workforce, so that, you know, again, that will collect wide evidence and provide general recommendations for improving practice and compliance with the Equality Act 2010. The second type of legal power we have is more specific. So it's where we suspect someone has committed what we call an unlawful act, which is a breach of the Equality Act 2010. And that is our power to either provide legal assistance, funding legal cases, or intervening in legal cases, and also taking our own actions, so bringing injunctions or taking investigations. You may well have heard this year about some of our really high-profile investigations, so the one involving the Labour Party and anti-Semitism, or the one involving the BBC and equal pay. So in both of those circumstances, we suspected unlawful acts, and then we carried out an investigation to collect evidence about whether or not, and made findings about whether or not an unlawful act had in fact been committed. But the last type of enforcement power that I want to talk to you about is a specific power under the public sector equality duty that we have. And that power is to carry out an assessment and, if necessary, issue a compliance notice, which requires a sort of action plan and considers both, whether a public body has complied perhaps with the specific duties, done equality impact assessments, etc., and also the manner in which they've complied with the general public sector equality duty. So have they really, given due regard to eliminating discrimination in their decision making, for example. So again, we've announced a quite high profile one this year, which is a section 31 assessment, which is the section that gives us that power into the Home Office in relation to the issues of hostile environment and a follow-up to the Windrush reports. We've previously, several years ago, done an assessment into the Treasury UK government as to whether they were complying with public sector equality duty about budgetary decisions. So it's a really general power, but it does enable us to really look at whether public bodies are complying with public sector equality duty. And as a combination, those powers are really effective in us regulating the Equality Act alongside our other functions, which are, influencing, advising governments, UK government, Welsh government, to improve their decision making, hopefully, and also compliance with public bodies to ensure the Equality Act it really does have the impact that it's designed to do. And again, supporting legal cases where human rights are a significant issue, providing advice on human rights frameworks, and holding public bodies and organisations to account if we feel that they've not met the equality and human rights obligations they have to meet. I'm going to pass back to Geraint now for the next section and come back later and talk about the briefing.
Early this year, we published our research report, how the coronavirus pandemic has affected equality and human rights. The report covers areas of life and society, including education, work, poverty, personal security and justice, and of course, social care. And on social care, our research found that older people, disabled people, people from ethnic minorities, and particularly care home residents have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. We of course know the tragic consequences of the pandemic in care homes and for care home residents and staff, with at least 40% of the UK's deaths related to COVID-19 being of care home residents. But the impact of the pandemic in care homes goes beyond mortality rates. The lockdown restrictions meant increased isolation for care home residents who weren't able to connect in the same way with their family and friends, which impacted on their mental well-being and their health. We know there were many additional challenges as well, including challenges around accessing tests, accessing PPE, people being able to access services, including healthcare services and things such as advocacy. Outside of care homes, we know that local authorities have seen an increased demand for adult social care during the peak periods of the pandemic, and this has been the result of a closure of services, so things like daycare centres being closed, but also the impact of the pandemic in terms of staff absences and the challenges in recruiting new staff into the sector. There's also the challenge of protecting the NHS, which led to a number of people having to be discharged from hospital settings. There have been additional challenges for people receiving care in their home in terms of the availability of care and the restrictions on care, but also the challenges for local authorities in terms of providing care when people have taken the decision to avoid having formal care provided for them due to fears around catching the coronavirus. Workers in the care system have faced an increased burden and risk and major challenges in terms of the pandemic, major challenges in terms of their mental well-being and their health, and also in terms of morale in the sector. and the reductions that we've already just covered in terms of care provision has meant a huge increase in the number of people becoming unpaid carers, which is estimated by Carers UK to be an increase of 50% more in unpaid carers since the beginning of the pandemic. So in response to the emerging picture, in the Commission we decided to develop a specific programme of work on social care, which we have done and we have begun, and we've set ourselves some long-term goals in that area of work, including to ensure that government plans to reform social care take into account equality and human rights in policies and practice, and that public authorities and duty bearers and care providers are able to change their practice to safeguard equality and human rights for social care users. So far, our work in Wales this year has included scrutinising and advising the Welsh Government on their decision making in relation to care homes to ensure that the rights of older people in old care homes have been upheld, and we've been working closely with the Older People's Commission on this. We've published an equality and human rights briefing on the impact of the pandemic in care homes, which we'll go on to cover in a bit more detail shortly. And we are currently scoping out options for our longer term work to influence any social care reforms that are brought forward by the UK, Welsh or Scottish governments to ensure that equality and human rights are central to those reforms. Following the first wave of coronavirus, we recognised the immense challenges that was facing the social care sectors and the really difficult decisions that decision makers like Welsh Government and regulators and local authorities and providers were having to make in terms of balancing rights and responsibilities in relation to older people and disabled people in care homes. We therefore wanted to produce a briefing which sets out the equality and human rights framework as it exists in Wales in relation to care homes, to support organisations and any future waves, and to learn the lessons of the issues experienced during the first wave of coronavirus. In order to ensure that our briefing was relevant and reflected the experiences felt on the ground, we wanted to hold a round table, which we did, bringing together third sector organisations, public bodies, care providers, regulators, local government, to capture the issues and the challenges that organisations felt during the first wave. And a number of themes emerged, which I'm sure will be familiar to everyone here today, including, in particular, at the beginning of the pandemic, the availability of PPE and the availability and supply of testing. Challenges around access to advocacy services was highlighted, particularly for people with dementia. Hearing older people's voice and involving older people in the decisions made about their care was something that older people's groups raised with us, particularly in terms of choice and controlling decisions. The approach to visiting and some of the restrictions around visiting was an issue highlighted in terms of the impact that was having on care residents' mental and physical well-being. Providers talked to us about the contradictory and often complex guidance that was being regularly issued from a number of public bodies for care providers at the beginning of the pandemic, and some of the challenges in terms of keeping up with that guidance. We heard about the issues in terms of accessing services, such as the suspension of routine healthcare services, and also about the lack of parity with the healthcare service more generally. Many of these issues weren't new to the sector, but certainly have been significantly exacerbated by COVID-19.
So our briefing sets out these issues against the legislative framework for equality and human rights. including, of course, Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights as incorporated by the Human Rights Act. You know, the right to life, which has been so significant this year, particularly for those people who are extremely clinically vulnerable, and those living in care homes really come into that category. We know there have been issues about testing, personal protective equipment being available, and really significant steps and changes to everyone's lives to try and protect people who are vulnerable and protect everyone from the current situation. But we know that you've been grappling with and having to try and balance that with other significant rights under the Convention and Human Rights Act. In particular, Article 5, the right to liberty in relation to things like capacity assessments, or where you're having to isolate people so they're spending much longer alone than they ordinarily would. And of course, Article 8, right to family and private life, where you've had to grapple with, I know, relatives, asking for no one to be visiting and others desperate to visit their relatives, and balancing that with what's available to you in terms of testing, PPE, or being able to make those visits safe against those Article 2 considerations and infection control. Of course, there are other international rights that are significant outlined in the briefing. So Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is about the right to health, and particularly healthcare appointments. We've all seen, that there's been difficulties in accessing healthcare sometimes, and that's a significant right that's having to be balanced again against the pressures on the health service and other issues relating to infection control in the current pandemic. And then lastly, devolved legislation such as Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Act, which encapsulates the principles of human rights such as voice, advocacy, autonomy, and other sort of Wales issues that and legislation that you're considering, such as the Welsh language standards. The briefing sets out a number of recommendations, predominantly for Welsh Government and public bodies, but there are some which are also relevant to and specific to providers and regulators, which I think may be helpful to you. So such as considering the Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Act to consider the broader wellbeing areas, including the quality of life when you're taking policy decisions, or day-to-day decisions which involve older and disabled people, and ensuring their stories and experience are captured and take account of those who are digitally excluded or have additional access needs when providing information, and ensuring access to independent advocate visits are resumed when possible. We know the principles and considerations of the Social Services Wellbeing Wales Act and the human rights legislation in Wales are in line with the values of the social care sector, and we do hope that by setting them out in the briefing in the legislative context, that we're providing you with a support and basis to ensure they're reflected in practice. We've heard things in relation to hospital discharge and the difficulties that providers in the social care sector have had during the current pandemic, and we really hope that our briefing can help you both when you're struggling to make decisions, balancing those rights, so you don't have a blanket no visiting policy on a day-to-day basis. You are considering the balance of those rights, but also where you feel you need to challenge others involved in the social care sector, you may be able to consider what's the most appropriate based on the legislative human rights and equality framework. We recognise the impossibly challenging times you've been through, and we want you to know that this briefing is designed to provide a supportive framework and not to add additional pressures. However, we really hope that you'll be able to use it, and we would welcome your feedback as to anything we can add, or anything you think would be helpful, particularly examples or anything that may be supportive and help you to comply with equality and human rights considerations, because the most important thing for us is the outcomes for the older and disabled people that you're caring for on a day-to-day basis are improved by the equality and human rights framework. We're not focused on the process, we're focused on what are the outcomes for older and disabled people, and we really would like to support you in regards to that. I'm going to pass back to Geraint now.
In terms of our next steps, we are continuing to gather views from stakeholders on the issues raised in the briefing to find out whether those issues that we raised are still relevant, what the current challenges are, and how the findings and recommendations can best support policymakers and providers to ensure that equality and human rights are upheld during the ongoing pandemic. We're also scoping out our options for the next phase of our social care work, and we are gaining stakeholders' views on those. A final decision on the sort of direction of that work is likely in the new year, but it will be really important for the success of our work that we build relationships with Care Inspectorate Wales and with providers to ensure that we maintain links with you to gain your insights and your frontline understanding of what the challenges are. So yeah, your insights and expertise will be really crucial for us in our ongoing work. So we would really welcome any feedback you have for us on the challenges you are facing, on the briefing itself, how relevant you found it, how useful you find it, has it been helpful. We'd invite you to share with us what you would find useful from the Commission in terms of support in understanding the equality and human rights framework in relation to the care sector. And yeah, just please continue to get in touch with us. We will share our contact details with the organisers of the event today, and so you'll have them. So yeah, we really look forward to getting in touch with you in the coming months and to hear from you. Thanks very much.
Wel, diolch yn fawr iawn. Diolch yn fawr iawn I gyd o'r cyfranwyr am siarad yn I bore yma. Thank you very much to all the contributors for talking to us this morning. Really interesting food for thought. So what I'm going to ask now is that whilst we go into before we go into the break, actually, I think Emma might have something interesting for us to look at during the break. I'm not sure, but if you can post now your questions either to one of the three contributors, presenters that you've heard this morning, or in general, if you'd like to ask questions of Care Inspectorate Wales or Social Care Wales, then please use the next couple of minutes to put those questions in the chat. We'll then pull them all together and we'll respond after you've had time then to go for a cup of coffee. So just now up until for the next 4 minutes, if you can pop your questions into the chat, as I say, either for our three presenters or in general questions for either organisation, then please do. And then we're going to break then at 10 to 11 and come back at 11 o'clock for the panel conversation. Please, if any of my colleagues want to add something that I've missed on that, please come in now or forever hold your peace. Okay, so I'm hoping now for a rush of questions to appear in the chat whilst Emma does something pretty for us to look at. Thank you guys, and we're coming back at 11 o'clock. Diolch yn fawr I chi gyd.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for rejoining us, and thank you for posting your questions. So because of the way Teams Live works, I will just have to hand over questions to people, and I'll disappear, and the person answering the question will pop up. So we're going to take that and we'll run through the questions that we can answer. Those that we're not able to answer today, we will get answers from EHRC and post those and share the answers on all of this work. And where we've been requesting information, we will be sharing that as well. And so the first question I'm going to go to is on visiting. So there's a question from Rachel that says we've made is asking about whether care homes have to do LFT testing for visitors and what CIW's view would be. And just to say that LFT, the lateral flow testing, is just one enabler of supporting people to have visitors in care homes. It's not compulsory, and if there are other ways of enabling people to have visitors, then that's fine. This is about defensible decision making, which is exactly what we've been talking about today. But we would hope that that's been discussed with people living in care homes and their families. In terms of the Equality Commissioners having webinars, we will ask that and get back to you on that one. There's a question from Steve about Article 5 right to liberty. We have young adults with learning disabilities who want to go home at Christmas, but they're stuck because of the 28-day rule due to an outbreak. And this is causing extreme anxiety for people. I am aware that the 28-day rule is being reviewed to to bring it down to 10 days for to self-isolate for 10 days. But I don't know. There is some discussion about how that applies to people in care homes, and I don't know the answer to that at the moment. In terms of whether it's a breach of their rights, I don't know whether Imogen or Nick want to answer that one. Just put your hand up and then we'll see. Nick.
Thanks, Vicky. It's not an easy one to answer, as with much of the conversations around human rights. Obviously, under the Human Rights Act 98, the government have to take positive steps to protect Article 2, right to life. So, but any action taken has to be proportionate, obviously. So, one of the reasons behind the 28-day lockdown when there's an incident would be to protect the right to life. But it's a really good question about whether that balance of rights is that protection of the right to life for others, and how that interacts with the Article 5 right to liberty. Obviously, with the right to liberty, you can only deprive someone of their liberty to protect themselves. And you know the Doll's process applies there. If you are depriving somebody of the liberty to protect others, of course, so that's a different route for the Court of Protection. So it's a really it's a hard one to answer. I think obviously only you know a judge would be able to make that determination. Is it a breach? But it's all about proportionality. So you know it's incumbent on the government to take action to ensure steps are taken to protect right to life, but then that kind of balance then against people's individual liberties, and like the question asked of people wanting to go home and understanding the frustration and the impact on well-being obviously that causes when people are, you know, people's kind of right to family life is then infringed. But again, it's that kind of weighing of rights and balances. So it's not a yes and no answer, I'm afraid. It's a tricky one.
Okay, thank you, Nicola. And somebody's asked whether 28-day closure is just an arbitrary number. This is really for Public Health Wales to answer, but my understanding is that it's about the time that the virus takes. 14 days is a time that the virus can take to continue to be infectious. And so 28 days is 2 cycles of that to protect people. But I think there's a review of that based on some of the evidence and the understanding of coronavirus at the moment. But really, I'm not. We would need to get you an answer from Public Health Wales for that in detail. Sorry, I'm just flicking through the questions now. So there's an anonymous. There's a question being posted about how can we expect RIs and managers to be less risk averse when all liability remains with them for decision making. Regarding the person's care and well-being. I'm just going to check if any of the panel members want to answer this one. No, okay.
Vicky, sorry, it's Catherine here from Social Care Wales. I think it is a really pertinent question. We do know that providers do, you know, they are seriously and quite rightly so worried about that particular issue. I mean, we don't have the exact answer, but I think one of the things that we've all talked about collectively, isn't it, is about that recording of decisions and about that defensible decision making. And I know we've had, you know, big conversations with local authorities, providers, and Inspectorate Cymru about what it is you need to see. And we're hoping that case recording work will go some way to actually helping people have a little bit more security in the decisions that they're making. It won't be 100%, obviously, but that's the point. That was the driver behind the work, was to be able to set out why you were making that decision, and that there may well have been an agreed degree of risk, but that was acceptable in wanting people to have, having control, reasonable control and decision making over their own lives. So we're hoping that piece of work will go some way to help people set out clearly decision making routes in case recording. Not sure that answers it all, but yeah, over to you again, Vicky.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. And there's a question to Geraint. Unfortunately, Geraint's not able to be on the live panel with us, but also to Imogen, that lateral flow testing is deemed to be only 50% effective. By allowing visitors to be tested and visit families, is a good possibility that residents may get infected. Withholding the facility of LFT, would I be denying someone's human rights or protecting others from harm. Does anybody, Nicola or Imogen? Oh, sorry, I can't see. Nicola.
Yeah, it's thanks, Vicky. It's just a really tricky one, isn't it? You know, it's all about how the different rights interact. So by maybe restricting somebody's right to family life, for example, Article 8, you know, you may be protecting somebody's right to life, Article 2. So it's a really tricky one to answer, and there probably isn't a definite answer at the moment. It's one thing that you know a judge would make a decision on something like that if there was any kind of challenge. But it is that balance. It's and I think going back to what Catherine said about that recording of decision making, about why decisions have been taken. What is the appropriateness of those decisions being made, having that kind of evidence trail for that decision making process, because there is no definite answer at the moment, especially from our perspective anyway.
Okay, thanks, Nicola. The whole reason we wanted to focus on risks, rights and responsibilities today is because these are really difficult, complex decisions that we know that you're faced with and having to make. What we hope is that these should be decisions that are made, not that you feel that you're left with on your own, that there should be others, there should be local authority commissioners, health boards, people, their families are involved in this, that this isn't just your sole responsibility, although I accept the point about the role, the accountability of responsible individuals, but in the case of the pandemic, then these are decisions that need to be made collectively. And I know Public Health Wales and environmental health officers locally and the local incident management teams are there to try and help and support people with some of these really difficult decisions that you're having to make. So I suppose the stress is that we don't want people to feel that you're on your own as RIs in having to deal with these issues. I can't see any other questions, so I'm going to.
There was one about children's. If you're somebody came in quite early on saying that there hadn't been enough about children and young people.
Okay, thanks.
Which I'm happy to pick up a little bit more about. I think it was it Deborah, I think, made the point that we hadn't touched perhaps enough on the human rights and of children and young people of being involved in decision-making processes and so on and so forth. And I suppose I just wanted to come in and sort of say that yes, that last piece of work I mentioned that we did for Social Care Wales, which I'm not sure whether it's been published or not, but we may be able to share the link to it. I know it was a kind of discussion paper which we produced ahead of an event on this subject. And we recognise within that again, the legislative framework's really clear that children and young people should be involved in decision making when they're subject to statutory processes, and that that actually there's really good kind of evidence to suggest that actually when children and young people are involved, workers develop a better understanding of their needs. Young people are more likely to be empowered, feel like they're sort of part of the positive changes happening in their family, and that really importantly, where children and young people are engaged, they're more likely to report positive experiences from child protection processes, and experience less kind of anxiety and alienation. And we heard when we did that piece of work for that discussion paper, we heard some really good emerging good practice from local and providers in sort of hearing the voices of children and young people. But I guess the kind of key message was that it takes time and skill to really get alongside children and young people and really get some insight into their emotional worlds, and that of course there can be some real dilemmas and tensions when what children want or what they say they want doesn't kind of seem to fit with everybody else's ideas, or it seems to put them at greater sense of risk, and balancing all of that out can be really difficult. And certainly what we found from our review of the evidence is that the things that children and young people value the most in all of that are trusting relationships with key workers who can really see them as a whole person, and can understand how their families work, and can hear the good things and the bad things without judgment, and getting really clear, accessible, timely information information, and being able to sort of contribute in the way that they want to, and that might not be going along to a meeting, or it might be, but it might be, you know, being involved in decision making in a range of other ways. So those were some of the sort of key themes that came out. Again, it's a real difficult balancing act, but that was certainly some of the sort of findings that came out of our piece of work.
Thanks, Imogen. Catherine, there's a question about RI support networks, like Social Care Wales are doing for home managers. I know that you've been working with HEIW on this and Improvement Cymru. Do you want to just say a bit about that?
I can, yes. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. Yeah, we piloted. There were a couple of approaches. Some care home managers on the call might be aware that there was a piece of work that was led by Public Health Wales called the Cwtch approach, which we partnered on. That was one way of trying to pull together a model and way of working of peer support networking. Social Care Wales then went on to develop a slightly different model, which we tested out with, which we're currently actually testing out with home care managers. Time for You, everything's got to have a title, isn't it? Because we don't know what we're talking about otherwise. So Time for You, it was called, and that has been. We are really pleased with that response and the effectiveness of it, because we originally thought we would just do 6 sessions, but the home care managers have engaged really well on it and have asked us to continue that work. We are still facilitating the sessions. Originally, the idea behind the model is that you bring people together, you help them learn how to facilitate those sessions, etc., and then they become self-sustaining. But I think we all recognise just at the moment that actually being given facilitation responsibilities is the last thing that people want when they come together in a peer support environment. So we are keeping that group going and facilitating ourselves. I know we did have a question earlier on around whether or not we would be able to roll that approach out somewhat to other groups. Just at the moment, we can't do it because we don't have capacity. We are similar to everybody else, and I know our situation is not as pressing as providers, but we have got a lot of people off sick at the moment or with caring responsibilities. But we are going to look at using that model now in the new year. And I know somebody asked us earlier on, and I've said if you would like your area, service area, to be considered for that Time for You model, then please write to us and we'll have a look at how we can take it forward. It is going to be a priority for us, because that support and supporting the well-being and resilience of the workforce is pretty key to everything that Social Care Wales wants to do now. So we will reprioritise our work programme definitely in the last quarter of 2021 and in the first quarter of 21-22 to make sure that we can offer this type of support to others. It does seem to be working well. People take control of it, and we are just there to help those conversations move forward. But there's a lot of problem solving and a lot of just sharing anxiety and support and ways of working. So it is working really well as a model, which we will take forward. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr, Catherine. Okay, I think we've covered most of our questions that we can answer today. I'd like to thank the panel members for joining us. If after today, after this morning, something occurs to you that you want to ask us, then please do email in and let us know. We will put some questions, so the question that's being asked about best interest decisions and the COVID vaccine, we are asking about that actively at the moment, and we will post that as soon as we, on our usual COVID FAQs, as soon as we have a clear answer to that. And the answers to questions today we will share as a result of today's session. We had debated whether to have breakout groups today, to give you time to talk to each other and to share positive practice, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and what you've learned. But because this was the first time of us doing this with a large group of people, we didn't feel we wanted to take that risk. But we are really interested in sharing what's worked and examples of positive practice. So if there is anything, please let us know. We're happy to publish those, share those anonymously or named. But please do let us know and send those in to us. Keep checking CIW and Social Care websites for latest information. and you can follow us both on social media via Twitter and Facebook as well, and we'll keep information updated through those social media channels as well. Just to say again, thank you for your time. I know that you're really busy and we do really appreciate you joining us here today. We have another event in January which is going to focus on safeguarding and the new Wales safeguarding procedures, so if you can join us for that. We will ask for an evaluation of today's event just in terms of how has this worked for you. Is it okay not having breakout groups? Would you have preferred it if we'd had breakout groups? Do let us know. And I think that's it. So just for me to on behalf of everybody here, Social Care Wales, and all of us working in the background here, to wish you Nadolig Llawen, and let's hope that 2021 is a bit less challenging than 2020 has been for us all. Thank you very much, everybody. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr. Da bo.
Bye. Thank you.